Good morning. How's everybody doing? All right. It's a little cheery. I don't know. Average response from the audience. It's a pleasure to have everybody here this morning. This is the third year that we have conducted what is now an annual poll of Americans' perceptions of higher education. Some of you know that Gallup has been doing an annual poll of Americans' perceptions of K through 12 now for 45 consecutive years. So I'm hopeful that we're off to that kind of stretch as it relates to how we're thinking about higher education. And this year, different from the previous years of the Lumina Foundation Gallup poll, we've also added a new dimension by doing a poll of American business leaders, asking many of the same questions of them that we have of Americans in general. And so we've found a lot of interesting things. Before I dive into the results, let me just do a couple things. First, introduce myself. My name is Brandon Busteed. I'm Executive Director of Gallup Education, and want to start by thanking our partners at Lumina Foundation. This has been now a 3-year collaboration, and certainly those of you who know Lumina's work, they have been investing more dollars and more thinking into higher education than pretty much anybody I know. And so it's been a delight to work with them, and particularly Courtney Brown. Where are you, Courtney? Just thank you so much for all the energy you've put into this and the thinking into this process. And on our team at Gallup, there's been a whole bunch of people involved in this. The list of thanks could go on, but somebody in particular who has helped us engineer this entire project and this event, Catherine Black, thank you very much. Please wave your hand. Yes, thanks. You can put it up a little higher. Catherine has done a remarkable job pulling all this together. And then just a thanks to all of you in the higher education ecosystem. There's a lot of friendly faces in the audience from higher ed associations, other business organizations, and certainly higher ed institutions themselves. And I think Gallup is very grateful for all of the input that you have provided to us, and we certainly are trying to open our doors more to that. We're probably doing more research and education than anybody in the country right now, and have ramped up our efforts on this dramatically, and so continue to plan to do that. And our limitations are really simply the things that we can think of asking people, right? So your ideas about different research agendas we might pursue, audiences that we may want to hear from, we're certainly open to your input. So with that, I kind of want to preface these findings today by saying that a good number of them are going to sound and look pretty negative about how things are going in higher ed. And I just think it's important to start with some commentary on that before we dive into what could be seen as negativity. See, I think this is not just an American higher education issue, right? If we're not careful, we could think that it is very quickly. And I actually believe that the country has started to act as if this is an American higher education issue. Here's the dirty little secret. The whole world is trying to figure out their education system right now, right? This is true across K-12. It's true into higher education. I don't know anybody, including the countries who are at the top of PISA standardized testing scores, that are happy with how things are going in their educational system. I sat on a panel not long ago with the ambassador from Singapore, and they're number one in PISA standardized testing scores, right? So he was there because people wanted to understand what has Singapore done to kind of knock this out of the park. And he was concerned, this was fascinating, he was concerned with how their country was doing on things like entrepreneurial activity and energy. And so even Singapore is not happy with where they are. So before we talk about U.S. higher education, I just think it's important to anchor it in this worldwide conversation and concern around how are we getting education right. The world has changed in ways that many of our educational institutions have just not been able to keep pace with. And I would submit to you an interesting idea, and I'm curious what your reaction is to this, that I actually believe that U.S. higher education is the crown jewel of the entire world. So think about this for just a minute. That even though some of us feel like America's image around the world has been tarnished in recent times, Gallup has actually done this from our world poll, more people all around the world still would want to move to America than any other country. Okay, so we are still very much in this position of world leader in the most simple respect of where would you want to move, right? People say America more than any other country. And if you think about so think about how the world views America, right? Obviously still in a very admiring place. Think then of all the institutions in the United States that they may be thinking of as they think about what makes America great. Okay, you could ask ratings of our military, of our executive branch, of our police force, of our education system, right? But if you think about U.S. higher education specifically, there are families all over the world whose dream it is for their child to have them go to a U.S. college or university. And I think that's a profound statement that we all need to think about very carefully, because in the last several years, we've been de-investing in U.S. higher education in this country. Double-digit cuts in state funding for higher education, federal cuts in this, right? We're having conversations about rating systems because there's this big question of the value proposition of higher education. I think if I can encourage any of us to start with this in mind, it's that we need to treat this thing called U.S. higher education as the crown jewel of the entire world, because I think that it is. We need to be investing more in it as opposed to de-investing in it. So, with that said, let me dive into some of the findings that we have uncovered here. So, first of all, most Americans believe that higher education is available. So 67% of Americans say, yes, it's available to anyone who might need it. The trick is that most of them don't think it's affordable. Almost 80% say that it's not affordable to everybody who needs it. So obviously this is the basis of a lot of the national conversation we've been having over the last few years. Dramatically rising cost of tuition. What has it prompted us all to do? Question the value of this thing that we've always just trusted and assumed, right? 30 years ago, if you got a college degree, that was just assumed to be a ticket to a lot of great things, a good job, a great life, etc. And so when the price tag starts to get a little hefty, people are starting to question that. When college graduates get a degree and don't end up in a job that they thought they were going to have, people start to question this. So it's really no surprise that affordability has become a big driver of this conversation. What's interesting, though, is that Americans still very much connect education beyond high school to the American dream. So almost every one of us in this country believe that education beyond high school is important. 94% of Americans. This is interesting, of course, because only about 38% of Americans have a degree from a higher education institution. So the majority of us still do not, and yet all of us in this country value it. That's a really important point. And then when we ask them questions about whether they see the connection between higher education and other things that we know that they want, like a good job and quality of life, there's a real connection here. So you could make a simple statement that the college degree is still very much part of the American dream. And that's a powerful statement. I'll share some data that shows how that's kind of taking place in the minds of adult Americans who are thinking about going back for education. So Americans say it's important now, having education beyond high school, and they also believe that it's going to be more important in the future. In fact, almost every one of us agrees that it's going to be even more important in the future, not less important. And I think it's safe to say that whether there are organizations or whether President Obama says it's so, Americans believe that this is a national goal. 90% think that we need to increase the percentage of Americans who have a post-secondary degree or credential. This is a national goal. And what's fascinating, there's all kinds of tidbits in this data, obviously, as you look at it, but this was one of these two data points I'm going to share with you were a couple of the most stunning ones to me, because it shows you the action steps that Americans are taking towards this goal. Now, these are adult Americans who don't yet have a post-secondary degree. 43% of them have actually taken time to research degree programs that might be good for them. And even beyond that step, 40% have actually talked with a college advisor or recruiter. Now, last year, we estimated that 35 million adult Americans said they were very likely to pursue a degree in the next 12 months. 35 million Americans. There's only 17 million college students in the entire United States right now. So you've got twice as many sitting on the sidelines, not just passively wondering what's going on in this, but they're taking very real active steps toward it. Now, here's a couple interesting little things. We know the population age demographic in the United States for traditional age college students is going to be on the decline for probably the next 10 to 20 years. So if your institution thinks that it's going to grow enrollment by focusing just on traditional age college students, that's going to be a really tough market for the next couple decades. But there is just so much appetite. 35 million people, and almost half of them taking real steps towards some kind of degree or certification out there. We have an enormous opportunity, all of us. I don't care what type of institution you are. This is an enormous opportunity. Now, we also found, thanks to the third year, there's some first peeks into trending data. And although the support for online degrees as a quality degree is still low, we found a very significant surge in the percentage of Americans who believe that an online degree is a high-quality degree. Now, Gallup, separate from this poll, did some polling off of our nightly poll several months ago about people who are enrolled in online courses and online degree programs. And why they're doing it is pretty straightforward. Those who are enrolled in these programs do it because it's cheaper and it's more convenient. Right? I can pursue a degree in my town that isn't available at the local university or community college here. I can do it on the weekends, at night, you know, before and after my job, and I put my kids to bed. So it's really clear why they're doing it so far. The hurdle for most of them was that they don't yet believe that employers value an online degree. But the second that employers start to show that they value an online degree, I think we're going to see a lot of things change as it relates to those who are thinking about and pursuing them. So as the U.S. population goes, it's jumped from 30 to 37% who say that they believe an online degree is a high-quality degree. And interestingly enough, when we polled business leaders about this, we said, all things considered, you have a candidate who got the same degree from an online degree institution versus a traditional college or university, would you consider hiring them? And 47% said they would be very likely or somewhat likely to hire a candidate from an online degree compared to a traditional degree, all things considered. Now, we can read into that a little bit, and we're interested in doing some deeper digging on this item, because it appears that what business leaders are saying is it's really what you know and what you can do for me. They care less about where you got your degree from, and I'll share that data with you in just a second. So here's a question. How do Americans measure the quality of degrees? And it's pretty clear how they measure it. This is interesting. So the last few years, the number one answer has been whether or not somebody gets a good job. Not a degree, by the way. They're not necessarily measuring graduation rates, although that came in at number 4, the percentage of students who graduate. What they really want when they graduate is a good job. And so that's still at the top of the list, but there was a very interesting surprise, I would say, in this year's data, that the quality of the faculty, the qualifications of the faculty, are the most important thing to Americans when it comes to quality. Now, this is really interesting, right? Because you could say, and again, another one to dig deeper on in the future, what do they mean by the qualifications of the faculty? I'm not so sure it means how many papers they've published. It could, right? But I think, linked to other data and research we've been doing, it's about, are these people really good teachers? Am I learning something by being in their class, whether it's physically in the classroom or it's online, right? And so this one, I think, is going to be a fascinating one to dig into in the future. What do they mean by the quality of the faculty? Because that just became the number one driver of how they think of quality. So then there's the next question of, okay, if this is how they're evaluating quality, can they find this information? And the answers on some of the most important things are that the majority of Americans have some significant difficulty trying to find this information about institutions. So the number one driver, the qualifications of faculty, 47% of Americans say this is very or somewhat difficult to know about an institution. 56% think it's difficult to find out whether graduates are getting good jobs. So that's at the top of the list in terms of difficulty. And then even things like the price of the degree and the percentage of students that graduate, which is pretty knowable information, and in fact is out there in a lot of different ways. There's still a lot of folks who say it's difficult to find that. So is there room for more information about these institutions and rating systems and databases that have this stuff? Absolutely, right? Americans are definitely interested in this. It's important to them, and several are having difficulty. Now, this was an interesting finding because we asked the same question of Americans that we did of business leaders on this one. And it turns out that both of them value the knowledge and skills of the candidate in that field. It's the most important thing for both of them. Business leaders value it a little bit more than Americans do, but they're pretty similar. Where we saw some big differences was in whether or not business leaders and hiring managers care about your major. Americans obviously think that major accounts for a lot more than business leaders do. Business leaders don't really care what your major is. What's more relevant to them is just simply, do you have the skills and knowledge to do the job I'm trying to hire you for, right? So that may be linked to major, but they don't see it strongly linked to major. 28% versus 47% of Americans. And then the real big gap was in the where you graduated from. Well, Americans still think that's pretty important. 30% think where you graduated from is important. It's about a third of the percentage when you look at business leaders. Only 9% of C-level business leaders think that it's important to know where you graduated from. So one of the interesting headlines from this data is that business leaders are clearly saying it's not where you go, it's what you know. And I think this is, in many ways, a very inspiring piece of data for America, because if you don't get into an Ivy League institution, or you don't have the opportunity to do that for any number of reasons, that could be okay for you. It's what you go do. It's what you know. It's how you do college. And so I hope that that's inspiring to a lot of us, and also challenging, right, to those who have these world-renowned brand names. I don't know that we can just sit on those laurels and assume that that's always going to work. This was probably the most troubling piece of data, is that we did a recent survey for Inside Higher Education on chief academic officers of institutions of higher education, and 96% of them were either extremely or somewhat confident that they are preparing students for the world of work. 96%. Pretty good report card in terms of grading themselves. But here's the trick. When we ask Americans, are college graduates in this country well prepared for success in the workforce? That number is 14% who believe that. So Americans' report card on higher ed, as it relates to this point, is closer to an F than it is an A+. And by the way, there was an interesting distinction between Americans from low-income versus higher-income brackets. Those from lower income, 24% felt that college was preparing graduates for success in the workplace. Higher-income Americans, it was 7%. So there was a noticeable distinction in this belief between socioeconomic status, which I find to be pretty interesting. Now, the report card gets even worse when you ask business leaders. When we ask them whether they think college graduates have the skills necessary for the jobs they're trying to fill, 11% strongly agree that that's the case. So look, you could say a lot of things from this data. I mean, this you could say, gosh, provosts have their heads in the sand. You could say maybe business leaders and Americans just don't quite appreciate all the different value elements of the degree, right? Like maybe they're not good judges of critical thinking and skilled collaboration and communication and a lot of these things that we all feel strongly we're producing. But here's the thing. This is a huge conversation that we need to have in this country. We have to figure this out. And this isn't just the responsibility of institutions of higher education. You could look at this and point a lot of fingers at presidents and provosts. Be very careful with that, because this is as much about pointing fingers at large employers and business leaders and the students themselves as it is everything else. We need to move closer to a world of shared responsibility in higher education, not just shared governance. Nice to have shared governance. We're now in a world where we need shared responsibility. If business leaders don't step up in partnership with institutions of higher education, how do you provide internships and job experience and all the things that they want if they're not actively participating in this? So I frankly don't care who starts it, whether the CEO walks into your office at the campus and says, hey, President Jasek, I'd like to talk to you about this, or whether you as a college president going out into the community, reaching out to these employers. It's just got to happen, because this data point right here is just something we should all be really ashamed of. Business leaders in this country, I was shocked by this. We asked them, do you think the U.S. higher education system has the highest quality higher ed system in the world? Only 19% strongly agreed with that statement. That's stunning to me, because if you just ask me the question, hands down, the U.S. has the best higher education system in the world. If you look at any of the rankings on international institutions, right, the U.S. always has like 90 of the top 100. The rest of the world certainly thinks we have the best higher education system, but for some reason, our business leaders, less than 20%, strongly endorse that statement. This was an interesting data point. We asked Americans and business leaders whether they'd be in favor of a policy that would provide green cards to foreign-born international students who get a degree in the U.S., and there's strong majority support in both categories. 55% of Americans support that, 61% of business leaders. And when it comes to higher ed and business collaboration, very few business leaders think that there's a great deal of collaboration happening right now. 13%, no surprise. I mean, each one of our institutions can come up with a little example of a great collaboration between their institution from an academic perspective and some sort of employer. But at a large scale, we're not really owning this. This is playing out in the data, but here's the good news. Everybody's in favor of it. 88% of these business leaders favor increased collaboration, and 77% say they need to do more. So they're recognizing their role in this shared responsibility, and they have an appetite for it. It was interesting. We did a project for a school in a large metropolitan region, and we interviewed business leaders in their area. And we asked them, you know, what do you want from this particular university? And every one of them, their number one answer was, we'd like to have the opportunity to provide more internships and real-world experience in our business. And then we asked them questions about what was holding them back, and it was just the most simple answer ever. No one's ever reached out to us. That was it. Now, they didn't see their role as reaching out to the university, which could be an obvious thing for them to do, but their answer as to the hurdle that was keeping them from doing that was just simply that no one from this university had ever reached out to them. These are things that we can all do. Now, an open-ended question that we asked at the very end of the survey of the business leaders, and we asked them, what do they want most from college graduates? Numbers 2, 3, and 4 were some of the obvious things like skilled communication, collaboration, critical thinking, but number 1 on their list, just a really simple request: internships and on-the-job experience. Now, this is where we're really challenged, right? Because we think about different majors as having more or less relevance to work preparation and internships, right? So it's really obvious to understand the connection between internships and engineering and, you know, really practical things. But then we've got all these other majors that people, I think, make the mistake of disconnecting from relevancy in the job, okay? Philosophy majors and art history majors. And this is a funny side point. Most of the art history majors that I was friends with at Duke, they're all investment bankers now. Well, there's obviously some kind of connection and relevance there. I don't know what it is, right? But my point is that I don't care what major we're talking about. Every single one of them needs to figure out the relevance to the workplace and to provide students with more real-world experiences and application of what they're learning. We can do this in all of our majors. This is not just about a STEM effort. This is not just a computer science effort, right? I think it's something we can do across all of them. So I'm going to conclude my remarks there and invite our panelists to come to the stage, and you will have an opportunity to ask them questions and me questions following that. So Scott, if you'd like to lead us off. Thank you very much.
So good morning, everybody. These are really important issues, and we now have the results of the Gallup analysis, and now we're going to go micro with the opinions of 3 experts. And we have here to my left Nancy Cantor, who's the Chancellor of Rutgers University at Newark. She is new in that position, but not new to leading institutions of higher education, having come from Syracuse University. She was also previously in charge at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and provost at the University of Michigan. So diverse range of institutions. Throughout her career, she's been known for pushing for a more diverse student body, reaching all kinds of students, and for involvement between universities and their local communities. Then we have Jamie Marasotis. Jamie is president and CEO of the Lumina Foundation, which is a key player right now in efforts to encourage more Americans to get a higher education, to encourage colleges and universities to recruit more Americans, and to have them complete their degrees, and to figure out what their degrees actually mean. So these are multiple areas where Lumina has been a leader. And then we have Steve Odland, who is CEO of the Committee for Economic Development, which is a business-led organization that does work on economic issues, and he has previously been the CEO of several companies, so he can speak from the perspective of business leaders, both from his own association and from his past. I want to start, Nancy, with you, and with the big contradiction that Brandon noted.
Jamie
and you know, now one of the other things I should say, in that provost survey, we discovered as well that provosts agree that grade inflation remains a big problem in American higher education, and perhaps grade inflation is the way they look at their own efforts on the world of work. But do you think the provosts were right, or the business leaders and Americans were right in terms of the job that colleges are doing?
So you know I'm going to say neither, right? So I think the most important thing there is, and this is the social psychologist in me talking, it depends on the frame of reference. So when you ask a provost that, they're thinking what I would call inside out. They're looking at particular efforts to do technology. They're looking at efforts to get students into the real world. They're looking at the latest internship collaboration that they did. When you ask Americans or business leaders, they're looking from the outside in. And they're asking questions about whether higher ed is really reaching a broad enough pool of students, whether the preparation is for a select group of students who then could have gone anywhere anyway. And they're really asking the hard question, I think, about how inclusive higher education is and whether our preparation is specific to the kinds of jobs that are out there that will really make higher education credentials a private gain as well as a public good. So it's all a perspective taking. Having said that, they are both wrong in the following sense. This is not about higher education doing it by itself, nor is it about the public being able to stand back and say, okay, what are you providing? It's really, and I think Brandon said this before, it's really about collaboration. So what I would ask is, have those provosts reached out and really engaged in a public-private conversation about what higher education needs to be doing? And have Americans really thought through in public dialogues what it is that we could do differently to reach a broader audience, to prepare people better.
But when you look at, say, you know, so you're a new chancellor, and you want to figure out if you're doing a good job in this area, what do you look at?
Well, so what I do, for example, is I go into the city of Newark, and I spend a lot of time with CEOs, with foundations, with city politicians, with public school leaders, thinking about who's out there, who's really out there in this very diverse metro region, and what are we doing to really reach those students and provide them with the kind of pathway to opportunity that American higher ed should be. You know, we think, in a sense, there's a conundrum here or a contradiction, which is that on the one hand, everybody knows in a knowledge economy that a higher ed credential is absolutely more critical than ever. As a result, we can be more critical of higher ed than we might otherwise be, because it's a really important credential.
But before going on, one of the parts of the survey of the public thinks it's important to know what whether graduates get jobs. Right. And there's significant debate within higher ed about the relevance of job placement statistics. How relevant is a job placement statistic, and how do you feel about the way they're used to compare institutions?
So I'm one of the people who believes job placement statistics are tremendously important and relevant. I also believe we have terrible data on it. And virtually nobody really understands exactly what our job placement. And part of that is the turbulence of the market. And so it is actually very hard to trace that. What's really important about job placement statistics is getting a dialogue within and without higher ed about what are we preparing students for? Where are they going? The broader we reach an inclusive population of students, the more important it is that, in fact, we have some pathways and trajectories that we can predict and say are reasonable given what the costs are of higher education. So I'm not at all one who believes that we should shy away from that, but I also don't think that's an easy measure by any means.
Steve, I want to turn to you and ask, were you surprised by the apparent disconnect between how college leaders view the way they're doing this and the way business leaders think?
Well, I wasn't. I spent 13 years as a CEO and have run Fortune 200 companies, but I also spent some time as an adjunct professor in a graduate business school, and it's amazing how the world looks different from those two perches. I think you have to separate it out into what are the objectives. And in academia, I think the objectives that we had were to teach people to think. And I think in the business world, our objectives were to find people who had the skill sets that were requisite for the job position that we needed. Further, I think if you dissect the needs of business, you will get different answers if you're recruiting for entry-level positions than if you're recruiting for more experienced positions. So, in other words, from an entry-level perspective, I would say we had a big disconnect with what we could get out of campuses and what we needed. And so we were having to retrain all the students fresh from undergraduate programs in how to make presentation skills, how to do business, how to write for business, sometimes how to dress and interact with customers, simply because they're used to texting each other and they're not used to sort of client interaction sort of things. So there were different needs, and therefore we would have rated the importance of the institution from which we recruited as more important. Once you're looking for somebody with 10 years or more with experience, just to put a spread in there, it didn't matter. They could have had an online degree. They could have had no degree. We hired executives with no college degree but had the requisite business skills and experience, and that was more important. And so I think I would have answered. I can go through here and tell you, depending on which position we were looking at in the circumstance, I would have answered the questions differently.
Now, I was surprised by how few business leaders said they care about the alma mater of the person they're interviewing, or are potentially hiring, because we write all the time about great universities that struggle to get recruiters from companies that say, we will only recruit at 10 universities, and we are going to assume that a Princeton grad knows more than a Rutgers Newark grad, and we have somebody here who will tell you that's a really flawed decision.
Having taught in both places.
Yes, having taught in both places, but that is the way an awful lot of leading businesses recruit. They say so were they telling Gallup what they thought was the right answer as opposed to the way they actually act?
No, and you have to discriminate between large businesses and small as well. I think in large businesses who bring in large classes of people into a marketing program or a sales program or a finance program have their favorite universities where they've had success. There's also geographic importance to this. There are relationships between the universities. And so from an entry-level position, those kinds of recruiting relationships do matter. I think once you're going out into the job market and seeking experienced people, I don't think that the pedigree matters as much, and you don't go to the same place because you're trying to find somebody with the requisite set of skills and experiences.
But when leading businesses seem to embrace that hierarchy, do they reinforce the attitude that it's where you go?
Well, yes, and branding matters as well. I think if you talk to people who will have an Ivy League education, they believe that they went to the best schools, and the press believes they went to the best schools. They are the best brand names, and when you're told consistently that Harvard's number one, Harvard's number one, Harvard's number one by all parties, you believe Harvard's number one, and therefore any place else is a step down, when in fact, depending on what you're trying to recruit, the skills for which you're trying to recruit, that may or may not be the case. And a lot of times, when I've recruited Harvard grads, they haven't worked out because they wanted to run the company tomorrow. And, first of all, I was in that role. And second, no, but more importantly, they needed some experience, and they weren't, I guess, aware of themselves enough to know that they needed that experience.
A lot of business leaders who are focused on these issues are quoted by governors saying we need more of a practical emphasis on this or that. And I was struck in the poll results that when the business leaders were asked what they cared about, it wasn't just internships was number one, as Brandon pointed out, but there was a lot of interest in critical thinking, communication skills, working in teams, all things that some people might say come in general education and traditional residential education. Has there been too quick an embrace of we all need bold new models when in fact a lot of the things business leaders say they want exist in traditional higher ed?
Well, I think they do. Look, we are the greatest nation on earth. We have the most powerful economy on earth. This has been fueled largely by the higher education system that we have. The business community is the number one consumer of the output. So what we have today has built everything you see around us. So I think we ought to start with where the presentation started this morning, which is what we have is pretty good, and we're the envy of the world. Now, having said that, we're always looking to improve, and I think this is where you get into these kinds of surveys. And so I think, the other point I would make, and we should let Jamie talk, the other point I would make is that the vast majority of higher education is not done at elite institutions, right? Mostly it's broad access institutions, and this is something that the Committee for Economic Development has issued a lot of work on, and the importance of two-year schools, the community colleges, the state programs, technical schools. I mean, some of the big gaps that we have in skills today are in cybersecurity, and you don't need a four-year, engineering degree for those positions. You need some training in it, but we can't get enough cybersecurity people. Dental hygienists today is a huge gap in what we have and what we need, and you don't need a Harvard education. You don't want a Harvard education to do that. So you start going through these needs that we have in society and the skills, and you have to then look at these broad access institutions as something that's very important, and businesses need to partner with those institutions.
So that is a perfect segue to Jamie, because you're looking at this from a broad policy perspective. As you look at the results here today,
yeah.
What surprises you? What concerns you?
Yeah, I'll tell you. Here's the good news, and I want to start with the good news. Though I think I'm a little less optimistic than Brandon is in terms of what was good in here. The good news is the public and business leaders are very supportive of this idea that we need more talent, that we've got to increase attainment, that the connection between increasing higher education attainment and meeting our talent demands as a society is very high. That's very good news. I think that's really exciting to see. But two things really struck me, Scott. The first one was these, and you've hit on some of these already, these really strong disconnects and competing tensions, whether it's the availability versus affordability, whether it's the work and the preparation, whether it's the higher ed and business collaboration, really big disconnects between what the public says and what business leaders say, or what business leaders say and what provosts say. And I think that's complex. I think there's a lot going on in terms of those things. But I think we've got to better understand why those disconnects appear to be so large at a time when this demand for talent, when this need for talent is so high. We've really got to get a better handle on that. The second is clearly, to me, the wake-up call that's in these data from business leaders, which is I cannot get, I've had the benefit of having seen these data, 10 days ago, and I cannot get over the fact that business leaders have such a low view of where you went to school and what you majored in. And I think that is a real wake-up call to American higher education, that in fact, we are either not doing a very good job of articulating what we are doing, which is what I suspect is going on, or what we are producing is not nearly good enough to meet their needs, or some combination of the two. But to me, that wake-up call is pretty startling. And to me, it really cries out for the need to sort of increase the learning outcome-based focus of what we're doing in higher education, to actually be able to better articulate what we're producing, how it relates to what Brandon was talking about earlier in terms of those two key things, getting a good job and having a better life, which is so important. I think we've spent a long time in higher education dodging the first and not being clear enough about the second. And I think we've got to be clear about both, and we've got to really articulate how we produce people who are prepared for good jobs and how they ultimately do have a better life as a result of their attendance in our higher education institutions. To me, that's a big part of these data.
How do you, you work with a lot of the institutions that most students actually attend.
Right.
And those institutions don't have as much money to spend on career centers. They don't have, they take in students with widely varying high school experiences, and so they don't all graduate at the same rates.
Right.
How do you evaluate success at institutions that, by virtue of their mission, are taking chances on students who other institutions wouldn't have the time of day for?
Yeah, to me, the most important thing that we should be talking about, forget about the rating system, forget about all these other things. What should matter most is what students know and are able to do with their degree. That's how we should be measuring the success of our higher ed institutions. And to me, that is not what we are focused on yet, though clearly there's some movement in that direction. So those kinds of institutions have the capacity to produce students with high quality learning outcomes, as well as any other type of institution, depending on how they use technology, depending on how they support the students with the kinds of services they provide, et cetera. But to me, we've spent way too much trying to articulate what the differences are among institutions, and not nearly enough around the question of what does a degree mean, what should it represent. To me, that's the most important part. And I've used this analogy before, but it's very odd to me that we still associate where you went to school with quality as opposed to what your degree means. And the analogy would be that, it's sort of like saying, I was sick, I went to Georgetown Hospital, so therefore I'm better, right? Because I went to Georgetown Hospital, right? Of course I did. I didn't go to DC General. Well, that doesn't make any sense. We have indicators of whether or not you are better, and we should be using those in terms of what we get from higher education. It's the quality of the jobs. It's the quality of life that you get out of higher education. It's the learning outcome. Those are the things that we should be measuring. Those are the things that ultimately should matter. And to me, I'm agnostic on where you go to school. I want to know whether or not you have those outcomes that are going to prepare you for work and for life.
So if you're preparing to be a nurse, you take a state licensure exam,
Yeah.
and a potential student can say, do the nursing graduates of College X pass that exam, which the state has determined suggests you're competent to be a nurse. What about all the fields where there is not an exam, where there is not a truly accepted measure?
Yeah, well, to me, this is the whole point, right? The whole point is that the degree should be measuring some combination of your generalizable proficiencies, your ability to do things, and being able to demonstrate that you can do those things, and your content knowledge. And so every degree should represent both of those things, content knowledge and generalizable proficiency. And so, so sure, you're going to be prepared to be a nurse practitioner. You take that licensing exam, that's fine. But for most people, that's not the way the world of work works, right? They not only don't just train for a specific job, they often cross industries over the course of their lifetime. And so therefore, they end up in very different spheres. It's very different than the historic work patterns where people would start in an industry and stay in that industry and sometimes move across job classifications. Now people cross job classifications, they cross industry, and it's our ability to produce those people who have those high quality, generalizable proficiencies that I think is most important in terms of what we're producing. And that's clearly what the business leaders say they value the most. That combined with the practical experience. I understand the internship and on-the-job experience thing, by the way. They want that practical experience, but all those other things are really, really important to the business leaders.
Nancy?
So the one thing I think that doesn't come out here, though, is that business leaders ought to be holding higher education responsible for the breadth and inclusiveness of their reach into populations. We should not, as an economy, allow the waste of talent that we allow. So we talk about investing in the kinds of institutions that Jamie and Lumina work with. One way to invest is to hold four-year institutions responsible for connecting to community colleges, for really creating seamless pathways. I like to draw the analogy, since we're doing analogies, between Major League Baseball farm teams. We ought to be producing farm teams in our metro regions, in our local communities, so that we are really cultivating talent. So it's not just what you know, it's who you are at the table and what kind of reach we have. Because we're never going to have a perfect system of getting students through. So if you think about the sort of optimal model, we have to produce a large range of talent in order to get the right workforce through. And we're not doing that.
I mean, I don't see it. I mean, can you imagine, say, a Michigan or Berkeley being punished based on their community college transfer record?
Can I imagine Michigan and Berkeley? No. But
Yeah.
can I imagine? Well, actually, I shouldn't say that. You know, Berkeley takes a huge
Yeah,
number
that's
of
true.
transfer students. So that's actually not true. And the Cal system's a perfect example. Now, they've withdrawn a lot of that in recent years. But their basis of their system is really a kind of pathway that we should all look to.
I mean, Steve, do you see businesses engaged in that issue?
You know, I think they're starting to wake up, and this is something that I know Jamie's been working on, CED's been working on, which is to say to the business community, we need to engage with all forms of higher education. At Office Depot, we had a headquarters in Florida. We could not get people with the requisite merchandising skills, pricing skills, modeling skills from the local area, and people are not moving as much as they once did. So people are tied, and you know, that's